Hi, everyone. My name is Chris Rincon, and I'm a clinical fellow at the Wellness Center at the CUNY Grad Center. Today, I'll be providing a brief overview of the workshop on managing procrastination in graduate school that I co-facilitated with Dr. Michelle Chu-Camba in December of 2024. To begin, I want to kick things off by dispelling a common myth or misconception that often gets floated, which is this idea that procrastination is tantamount to, or at the very least, an indication of laziness. People often discuss procrastination as if it's some sort of essential, deep-seated character flaw, right? As if people who struggle with it are simply weak-willed or disorganized or negligent. But hopefully, it'll become increasingly clear as we go along that procrastination has little, if anything, to do with laziness. For the purposes of this presentation, I'll be defining procrastination as making a decision for no valid reason to delay or not complete a task or goal you've committed to, and instead doing something of lesser importance, despite there being negative consequences to not following through on the original task or goal. So one thing that this definition highlights is that procrastination is, in some respect, an intentional decision. Now, having said that, it may happen very quickly, almost automatically, and it may function like a habit. So often you may not even realize that you've made the decision to procrastinate in many cases. Another key element of our definition here is that you needlessly put off or fail to complete something you made a commitment to doing. So generally, this involves substituting the task for something that is a lesser priority. And perhaps most critically, you do this despite there being a lot of disadvantages to procrastinating. So what tends to distinguish more general putting off or delaying behavior from a more serious procrastination problem is how bad the negative consequences are that follow the procrastination. Right? Sometimes the stakes are relatively inconsequential, but in other cases, there can be quite severe ramifications for failing to follow through on your commitments. But why, you may be wondering, do we sabotage ourselves in these ways? Why do otherwise intelligent, responsible, competent people engage in these self-defeating patterns of behavior, right? Even when they rationally understand the pitfalls of procrastination. Well, we in the mental health professions have come to understand that the core reasons people procrastinate generally have to do with the ways that they perceive themselves, other people, and the world more broadly. Right? We all have certain rules and assumptions that tend to govern our behavior. And oftentimes, these rules and assumptions are pretty helpful and reasonable in the sense that they are a fairly accurate depiction of how things really are, right? And are also flexible enough to account for unforeseen or extreme circumstances. However, we can also have more unhelpful rules and assumptions by which we try to lead our lives, right? A rule or assumption tends to be unhelpful when it is inaccurate or inflexible in some way. So listed here, we have some of the most common unhelpful rules and assumptions that have been linked to procrastination. These can be related to things like a need to be in charge, pleasure-seeking tendencies, fear of failure or disapproval, fear of uncertainty, low self-confidence, and depleted energy. We won't have time to go over each of these in detail, but I'd encourage you to take some time to peruse this list and see if any of these unhelpful rules or assumptions resonate with your experience. And of course, it's also worth noting that being a procrastinator doesn't mean that you operate under all of these unhelpful rules and assumptions that you see here. You may only struggle with one of them or some combination of them. And moreover, different unhelpful rules and assumptions may be more or less salient for you, depending on the specific situation or context that you find yourself in. So procrastination can carry with it a number of different consequences, depending on the situation you find yourself in. Some of these consequences might be considered to be positive, while others are more negatively balanced. Right? The main thing to understand is that these consequences are actually what keep your procrastination going in the long run by acting as reinforcers. right? The positive consequences, or in other words, the payoffs for procrastinating, understandably, are going to make you more likely to procrastinate next time you face the task or goal because you got something good out of procrastinating, right? It worked for you in some way. Perhaps it gave you some temporary relief from discomfort or made you feel empowered by seeming to affirm one of your unhelpful rules or assumptions. Or maybe the diversionary activity that you engaged in lieu of your more pressing obligation, was itself pleasurable or soothing in some way. Right? All of these benefits may drive continued procrastination in the future. And on the other side of the ledger, we have negative consequences, which generally make the situation worse in some way by masking, or rather by making the task or goal even harder or more unpleasant in the grand scheme of things. Right? By putting things off, your responsibility may snowball into something even more intimidating. Right? You may face punishment or repercussions from others. You may develop a profound sense of guilt or shame or anxiety. And crucially, the unhelpful rules and assumptions that drove your procrastination in the first place will only be further entrenched, right? Because you've not given yourself the opportunity to have them disconfirmed. So, kind of paradoxically, even the negative consequences are likely to drive further procrastination by making a daunting situation even more daunting and more unpleasant, right? Providing additional incentive to avoid in the future, creating a sort of vicious, self-perpetuating cycle. So now that we have a sense of what procrastination is and how it functions, let's discuss some methods for counteracting it. One of the best ways to militate against unhelpful thoughts and assumptions that may be driving your procrastination is by asking yourself some disputing questions, right? So if you're able to identify some of those counterproductive thoughts as they crop up for you, it can be useful to take some time to kind of dispassionately assess the evidence for and against that ideation. Right? Is it really the case that I'll be better off by commencing this task later? Or might I be better served by getting a jump on it now? Right? What would it be like to just go ahead and get the ball rolling without delay? How might I feel in either case? Will getting started make me more anxious, less anxious? For how long? Right? The idea here is to try to actively combat that voice in your head that's telling you that you'll be better served by starting later, right? So that you can take the first step towards completing the task. And the reason this is so important is because it's been demonstrated empirically that once people overcome that initial hurdle, that initial inertia, it tends to be a lot easier to keep going at the task thereafter. Right? Initiating the task provides crucial momentum that can motivate you to continue making forward progress. Right? So using disputing questions is a great way to push past that initial stuck point. Right? And related to this idea of using disputing questions is the notion of running behavioral experiments, right? In order to test the validity of your automatic thoughts and assumptions. Right? Sometimes you can simply reason your way out of these thinking traps, these thought distortions. Other times you may require more concrete, observable evidence, right, to convince yourself that an alternative approach is actually better indicated. For example, perhaps you're feeling really exhausted and unmotivated, and you've convinced yourself that you'd be better off starting your task once you're feeling more well rested or once you're feeling more inspired. I'm sure this is something that many of us can identify with. It's worth noting that these are testable hypotheses, right? You might, for example, choose to measure your tiredness or motivation level before and after a designated period of working on the task to see if it's really all that energy consuming, right? Or if maybe you've built the task up in your mind to be something much more taxing or challenging than it actually is. Or you might keep a running log of the times that you actually feel motivated to do the task, right? If that motivation never comes over a long enough time period, it's probably unreasonable to expect that you're ever going to be struck with some overwhelming inspiration, right? And maybe instead you just need to get the thing started so you don't have to continue having it looming over your head, so to speak. And in addition to using disputing questions and running behavioral experiments, here we have a few other strategies that you can use to overcome procrastinative tendencies. First, we know that people often get stuck at the warning tracks, right, by creating unrealistic all or nothing expectations for themselves, right? Telling themselves, for example, that all the stars need to be perfectly aligned in order for them to make any progress toward their goal. But in reality, there's almost always something that you could be doing right now that would contribute in some piecemeal way towards the completion of your task, right? If you're writing a research paper, perhaps you don't have all the information you need to complete the thing in one fell swoop, but maybe you could spend some time organizing your bibliography or chipping away at the introduction section. Right, breaking projects down into subtasks or discrete chunks can make them feel a lot less daunting, right? And can help overcome the intimidation factor of getting started. Addressing self-criticism can also go a long way toward counteracting this impulse to put things off. Right? A lot of people who struggle with procrastination tend to carry around a lot of shame and guilt about this tendency. And I think it's important to recognize, right, especially as graduate students, that the kinds of tasks you're being asked to engage in are legitimately very demanding and challenging, right? And it's only natural that you would sometimes experience lapses in your motivation and your focus. So, to the extent that you're able to do so, I'd advise you to try to extend yourself some grace and compassion, right? And in those moments when you're beating yourself up or being hyper self-critical about past mistakes or past procrastination, try to instead speak to yourself in a way that's a bit more encouraging, right? A bit more appreciative of all that you've already accomplished and that recognizes your capacity for growth and change, right? Your ability to be better today than you were yesterday. Okay. And on that note, thank you all for your attention. I hope you found this to be a helpful overview. And I wish you all the best as you continue to navigate your time in graduate school. Take care.